How do you stay close to a man you have to beat? Not outsmart in business, not out-argue at dinner, beat physically, on a stage, in front of judges who can only crown one winner. For almost a decade, that was the arrangement between Frank Zane and Franco Columbu. They trained together, joked together, critiqued each other's posing in cramped apartments after midnight, and then walked onto a stage and tried to take the one thing the other man wanted most. Most rivalries don't survive that kind of pressure. Theirs did, and the way it survived says more about who these two men really were than any trophy could. To understand it, you have to go back to a time before either of them was famous, before Mr. Olympia, before Hollywood, before either name meant anything outside a handful of gyms scattered across 2 continents. This was the so-called golden era of bodybuilding, a stretch running roughly from the 1950s through the 70s, when the physiques being built were less about extreme mass and more about proportion, balance, and a classical sculptural ideal. It was also an era defined by something modern bodybuilding rarely sees anymore. The top competitors actually trained together. They shared gyms, shared meals, and shared the same handful of cramped apartments in Southern California, long before any of them could afford much else. The rivalries that came out of that environment were forged under different conditions than rivalries today, where competitors are more likely to be strangers who have never shared a single set together. Frank Zane had already made a name for himself by the late 60s. He had won Mr. America, and the promoters of the Mr. Universe contest convinced him to compete there too, even though he had not planned on it. He showed up and got his first look at the man who would define the next decade of the sport. A tall, bulky Austrian in seersucker pants and a Hawaiian shirt looking nothing like the chiseled figure he would later become. That man was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Zane did not know it yet, but he had just met the center of gravity that would eventually pull Franco Columbu into his life too. Columbu's path to that same circle started even earlier, and from much farther away. Born in Sardinia in 1941, he grew up the son of shepherds, and as a boy he was small and was picked on constantly, until by his own account he simply got tired of it and started fighting back. He boxed before he ever touched a barbell. He met Schwarzenegger at a competition in Stuttgart, Germany in 1965, and the two of them got along instantly. When Schwarzenegger eventually moved to America, sponsored by bodybuilding publisher Joe Weider, he asked Weider to bring his friend over as well. Columbu landed in Santa Monica in 1969, and the two of them ran a side business to make rent, a bricklaying and patio building company they called European Brickworks. They were not very good at building patios, they were very good at building themselves. This part of the story is often overlooked on the way to the trophies, but it is the part that explains everything that came after. Zane, Schwarzenegger, and Columbu were not strangers who happened to compete in the same weight class. They were part of the same daily orbit. Zane later described how the three of them, sometimes joined by Dave Draper as well, trained together as one circle, 6 days a week, working chest and back, then legs, then shoulders and arms, cycling through a high-volume split with barely any rest between sets. Zane was working as a math teacher at the time, training in the afternoons during the school year and moving to 2-a-day sessions in the summer. This was not a rivalry that started on a stage. It started in a gym with sweat and shared effort, long before anyone was thinking about scoreboards. In late 60s and early 70s Venice Beach, the friendship between Frank Zane, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Franco Columbu extended well beyond the gym. Zane has described mini posing clinics the three of them held in Columbu's apartment, taking turns in front of each other and pointing out every flaw in each other's routines, down to foot placement, balance, and the exact angle of a twist. Later, after Schwarzenegger retired from competition, the others would still come to him for that same detailed feedback. He once told Zane that on a particular night, with those specific mistakes, he would have placed third. That level of honesty wasn't typical of casual acquaintances. It reflected a level of trust between people who were willing to be critiqued and rebuilt repeatedly by someone who wanted them to win. Outside the gym, the same group crossed the border into Tijuana for souvenirs, or went to a local high school to shoot archery. Zane recalled that Schwarzenegger could reliably hit the bullseye on his first arrow, and rarely managed it again after that. So when these men eventually competed against each other, they weren't doing it as rivals in the usual sense. They were friends who had made the same bet with their lives, knowing that only one of them could win at a time. That arrangement was unusual. They trained 6 days a week together, ate the same simple meals because none of them had much money, helped fix flaws in each other's posing routines late at night, and then months later stood a few feet apart under stage lights while judges decided which of them had the better physique. Few professions have an equivalent. A salesman doesn't typically spend his evenings helping a direct competitor close deals more effectively, but that was how this circle of bodybuilders operated, and it helped produce relationships that lasted longer than their competitive careers. The first head-to-head meeting between Zane and Columbu came at the 1970 Mr. Universe contest, where Zane won the overall title and Columbu won his weight class. It set the pattern for their rivalry over the following years, wins traded back and forth, the margins often small, with either man capable of beating the other depending on conditioning, which judges were on the panel that year, and a range of other variables that made competitive bodybuilding unpredictable. Physically, they were near opposites, and that contrast became part of how the sport described them. Zane was lean, symmetrical, and proportioned in a way other bodybuilders pointed to as a definition of aesthetics. He had one of the smallest waistlines of any Mr. Olympia, paired with wide shoulders that created a pronounced V-taper, and his physique was built around balance and flow rather than size. Columbu represented a different kind of physical achievement. At 5'5", he carried a dense, compact muscularity shaped by his background as a powerlifter. He treated the major compound lifts, the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift as the foundation of any physique, and his numbers reflected that, a deadlift over 700 pounds and a squat over 650, figures that would be considered elite even among dedicated strength athletes today, let alone someone who was also competing for bodybuilding's top titles. Their personalities matched their builds. Zane approached the sport almost like an engineer or a teacher, which again he literally was, breaking his training down into structured phases, setting long-term goals months out from a contest, and deliberately ramping intensity so that his hardest training landed in the final week before he stepped on stage. He thought about nutrition and recovery the way a scientist thinks about a controlled experiment, tracking small variables and adjusting them with precision rather than brute force. Columbu was blunter and more physical, a former boxer who didn't want to dance for an audience's approval. He wanted to do the work, show what his body could do, and let the applause come because it was earned, not because he'd performed for it. He had no patience for the showmanship that would later creep into the sport, the music and the choreography and the crowd-pumping routines. He believed the work itself should be the whole show. Two completely different temperaments, two completely different physiques, both shaped in the same gyms by some of the same training partners, chasing the same handful of trophies. It's tempting to think a friendship like that would eventually fracture under the weight of constant comparison. Every magazine cover, every contest poster, every gym conversation implicitly asking which approach was actually right, the precision or the power. But the contrast seems to have deepened the respect between them rather than eroding it. Each man was good at something the other wasn't, and competing against someone whose strengths were genuinely different from your own makes for a very different kind of rivalry than competing against your own mirror image. There was no real argument to be had about who the better bodybuilder was, because they weren't really doing the same thing. They were doing two different interpretations of the same sport, executed at the highest level either interpretation had ever reached. Zane had a rough year in 1975. Frustrated by how much attention the cameras filming the documentary Pumping Iron were giving Schwarzenegger, he pulled away and trained that summer at a different gym entirely, just to get some quiet. He finished a disappointing fourth at the 1975 Olympia, and seriously considered walking away from the sport. What pulled him back was an invitation to pose at the Whitney Museum of Art in New York alongside Schwarzenegger and Ed Corney. Being chosen to represent bodybuilding at that level reignited something in him, and he decided to give it one more run. The 1976 Mr. Olympia, held for the first time in Columbus, Ohio, was shaping up to be his moment. He came in lean, sharp, and as close to his ideal physique as he'd ever been. Almost everyone in the building expected him to win. Franco Columbu had other plans. He had spent 2 straight years finishing runner-up to Schwarzenegger at the Olympia, and with Schwarzenegger now out of the picture, 1976 was his window. His leg development that year was superior to Zane's, and when the judge's decision came down, it was Columbu standing at the top, claiming his first overall Mr. Olympia title. Zane walked away with a loss to a man he trained beside, joked with, and trusted enough to let critique his posing in private. That is a different kind of loss than losing to a stranger, and there is no easy way to be gracious about it in the moment. What didn't happen during this period says as much as what did. The titles kept changing hands. Zane's run from 1977 to 79, then a gap, then Columbu returning to win a second Olympia in 1981, after recovering from a serious injury suffered while competing in the inaugural World's Strongest Man contest, where he dislocated his knee carrying a refrigerator on his back and was sidelined from competition for years. Through all of it, the circle around Schwarzenegger, Zane, Columbu, and the others held together. These men kept training near each other, kept showing up to the same events, kept being photographed side by side at Gold's Gym and Muscle Beach, in images that are still circulated today as visual evidence of an era when rivals could also be genuine friends. After their competitive years wound down, their paths spread out in different directions, the way they tend to for most people once the thing that bound them together stops being the center of their lives. Columbu leaned into Hollywood, appearing alongside Schwarzenegger in films including Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator, and The Running Man, while also becoming a licensed chiropractor and a respected trainer in his own right. He was brought in to help transform Sylvester Stallone's physique for the Rambo films, adding significant muscle to Stallone's frame within a matter of weeks. He returned to Sardinia every year to visit the small town where he'd grown up, never fully trading his roots for the Hollywood version of himself that audiences saw on screen. Zane took a quieter, more cerebral path, devoting himself to teaching, personal training, and refining the training philosophy that had built his own physique, eventually writing and lecturing on the principles of balance and proportion that made him the standard other bodybuilders measured themselves against. He never pursued the same kind of mainstream fame that Schwarzenegger and Columbu found, content instead to let his physique speak for itself for the remainder of his career. Different stages, different spotlights, but the same foundation underneath both of them. Decades later, the bond within that circle continued to surface in public in small, telling ways. Old photographs of Schwarzenegger, Columbu, Zane, and fellow Golden Era figure Lou Ferrigno standing together at Gold's Gym still circulate online, and each time one resurfaces, it sparks the same debate that defined their era. Fans taking sides, comparing Columbu's density to Zane's symmetry to Ferrigno's size. The men themselves never appeared especially invested in settling that argument. They had already settled it, the only way that mattered to them, on stage, decades earlier, and what remained afterward wasn't bitterness over who had been declared better in a given year. It was respect for what it had taken all of them to get there. That is uncommon for a group of high-level competitors to sustain in any sport, in any era. The clearest evidence of how deep these bonds ran came under the saddest circumstances. In August 2019, Franco Columbu died at the age of 78, after becoming unwell while swimming off the coast of Sardinia. Near the town he returned to each year to visit family and attend local festivities. The response from his circle was not the polite, distant tribute typically offered for a former competitor. Schwarzenegger, who had known him since 1965 and asked him to serve as best man at his wedding, wrote a public tribute describing more than 50 years of friendship. The training sessions, the chess games, the construction work from their bricklaying days, the meals, the pranks, woven into a life he said was fuller and more colorful because Columbu had been part of it. Sylvester Stallone called him the strongest bodybuilder he had ever met, and said the lessons Columbu taught him had stayed with him for the rest of his life. This was not the language used to describe a former opponent. It was the language used to describe someone who shaped you. That is the core of the story once the trophies and stage photos are set aside. Frank Zane and Franco Columbu did not have a rivalry that happened to include friendship on the side. They had a friendship that happened to require them, every year or two, to walk onto a stage and attempt to take something the other man wanted badly. They trained side by side for the better part of a decade, identified each other's flaws in private so they could each improve in public, and then competed for real, with no theater and no soft pedaling, both wanting to win. None of that broke the thing that mattered more. It is worth asking why so few rivalries today resemble this one. Part of the answer is structural. Modern athletes in nearly every sport are kept apart by money, by competing camps, and by a media environment that profits more from manufactured conflict than from genuine mutual respect. But part of it was also the specific, almost accidental conditions of that particular time and place. A handful of broke, ambitious young men brought together in the same cheap apartments and the same unair-conditioned gyms, with nothing to do but train, eat, and push each other, long before any of them had reason to see one another as a threat rather than a teammate. By the time the threat arrived, the teammate relationship had already been built too deep to dislodge. That may be the actual lesson within this story, more than any specific training method or physique ideal. Real respect is not the absence of competition. Sometimes it is what remains after the competition has ended, when the titles have been handed out and the only thing left to measure is whether you would still want that person standing next to you. By every account that has survived from those who were there, Zane and Columbu always did, and that may be the part of the golden era most worth remembering. Not just the physique still debated in comment sections decades later, but the fact that the men behind them wanted the same thing badly enough to fight for it, without ever needing to stop being friends in order to do so.